2:14 in the morning, the deep-water oil platform Trident Alpha stood as a lone island of steel in the black expanse of the South China Sea. The security cameras on the lower landing deck did not see the black shapes rising from the water, but the motion sensors were already being bypassed by someone who knew exactly where they were. In less than 5 minutes, the 20 Americans on board would find out if their distress signal had reached the 7th Fleet before the radio room was silenced forever. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the constant, rhythmic thrum of the massive drilling bits. Far below the steel grating, the dark water of the Pacific churned against the massive pylons in a restless, oily chop. 6 figures emerged from the surf. They climbed the yellow steel ladders of the south pylon with practiced, mechanical speed. Their diving gear was matte black, designed to swallow the dim light of the moon. Each man carried a suppressed submachine gun slung tight against his chest. They reached the first maintenance level and moved in a low crouch. They did not speak. They did not use radios. They moved like a single organism, flowing around the heavy pipes and storage tanks of the lower deck. The lead commando signaled with a flat palm. The team split. 2 men headed for the stairs leading to the main control room. 2 more moved toward the crew quarters. The final pair targeted the communications array on the top deck. A lone technician stepped out onto the catwalk for a cigarette. He was 50 feet above the water, looking out at the dark horizon. He never heard the boots on the metal grating behind him. A heavy hand clamped over his mouth, while a forearm locked around his throat. He was dragged into the shadows of a nitrogen tank before he could drop his lighter. The struggle lasted 4 seconds. The technician was bound and gagged with industrial zip ties. He was pushed into a corner behind a stack of steel crates. In the main control room, the night shift was quiet. 3 men sat in front of a wall of glowing blue monitors. They were monitoring the pressure levels in the undersea well. The door to the control room slid open with a soft hiss. The workers did not look up. They expected the shift lead. Instead, they felt the cold muzzles of suppressed weapons pressing against the backs of their necks. The lead commando stepped into the light. He wore a tactical mask that obscured everything but his eyes. He pointed a gloved finger at the main radio console. One of the technicians reached for the emergency button. A short burst from a suppressed weapon shredded the plastic console an inch from his hand. The sound was like a heavy staple gun. Sparks flew. The technician pulled his hand back and shook with terror. The commandos moved with brutal efficiency. They used plastic flex cuffs to secure the hands of every worker in the room. One commando pulled a rugged laptop from his pack and plugged it directly into the platform's main server. Within seconds, the external satellite link was severed. The outgoing data streams died. The GPS beacon that marked Trident Alpha for the global shipping lanes blinked red and then vanished from the world's digital maps. On the upper deck, the communications team worked just as fast. They used small, shaped charges to melt the primary satellite dishes. There was no explosion. There was only a bright, white-hot glow and the smell of burning copper as the delicate electronics were turned into slag. The backup radio masts were cut with high-speed saws. The steel groaned as the antennas fell into the sea. The crew quarters were next. The commandos kicked in the doors of the small cabins. Men and women were dragged from their beds in their undershirts. They were forced into the central galley at gunpoint. The room smelled of stale coffee and fear. The 20 hostages were made to sit on the floor with their backs to the wall. The leader of the commando team checked his watch. It was 2:21 in the morning. The entire operation had taken 7 minutes. He walked to the center of the galley and looked at the frightened faces of the oil workers. He did not say a word. He pulled a small digital transmitter from his vest and pressed a single button. The signal traveled 200 miles to a waiting destroyer. The platform was no longer a civilian asset. It was a fortress. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the wind whistling through the ruined antennas on the roof and the distant, muffled roar of the ocean below. The trap was set. Now, they only had to wait for the Americans to come and try to take it back. 2:31 in the morning. The Joint Operations Center in Yokosuka, Japan. The duty officer stared at the primary display. The green icon for the oil platform Trident Alpha flickered once and then changed. It shifted from a steady green to a pulsing, jagged red. The lieutenant leaned forward in his seat, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his wide eyes. The air in the room was cold and carried the sharp, chemical scent of ozone from the server racks. "Trident Alpha just dropped off the net," he said. His voice was tight and low. He tapped a rapid sequence of keys on the encrypted console. No response came from the platform's main server. The telemetry was dead. Seconds later, a high-priority data burst hit his terminal. It was a pre-programmed emergency signal. 4 words appeared in stark white text on the screen. Unauthorized boarding. Communication severed. The lieutenant hit the red toggle on his desk. The alarm did not scream. It was a low, rhythmic pulse that cut through the quiet of the night shift. Within 3 minutes, the room was crowded with senior officers. Admiral Miller walked to the head of the long conference table. He did not sit down. His face was like stone in the dim light of the command center. "Give me eyes on that platform right now," the admiral commanded. An intelligence officer typed rapidly. A live satellite feed replaced the map on the main wall. The oil platform appeared as a gray skeleton of steel against the black water. The resolution sharpened as the satellite adjusted its orbit. Infrared heat signatures glowed on the lower landing decks. 6 bright points of light were moving in a tight tactical formation. "Those are not oil workers," the admiral said. His voice carried the heavy weight of 40 years of command. The intelligence officer pulled up a comparison file on a side screen. "The signature matches a specialized boarding team from the Chinese Navy," he said. "They took the platform exactly 9 minutes ago. We have 20 American civilians in the galley. They are likely being used as a shield against any heavy fire." The room went silent for a heartbeat. The geopolitical reality of the South China Sea settled over everyone. This was the match in the powder keg. "What is our closest asset?" the admiral asked. "The USS North Carolina, sir," the commander replied. "She is a Virginia-class attack submarine. She is currently 60 miles from the platform, running deep and silent. She has a full platoon of Navy SEALs on board for a training exercise." The admiral did not hesitate for a single second. "Authorize a Tier 1 recovery mission immediately," he said. "The rules of engagement are clear. The platform is American property, and our citizens are in danger. Tell the North Carolina to bring our people home. I want the borders neutralized and the facility secured." The order was encrypted and flashed across the Pacific in a heartbeat. 60 miles away, the USS North Carolina received the message through the deep water. The submarine began to bank and dive. The quiet hum of the nuclear reactor changed pitch. In the cramped berthing area, the lights turned a deep, blood red. The SEALs woke up instantly. They did not need an announcement. They knew the color of a live mission. The air in the submarine smelled of recycled oxygen and machine oil. Men began to pull on tactical vests and check the seals on their diving gear. The team commander stood in the center of the narrow aisle. "Trident Alpha has been seized by foreign commandos," he told them. 20 hostages are being held in the galley. "The opposition is professional, and they are well equipped. We are going in from below the waterline using the dry deck shelter. Check your weapons. Check your air. We launch in 45 minutes. The men nodded in unison. They worked in absolute silence, checking every bolt and every battery. The North Carolina surged forward at 30 knots. The hull groaned under the immense pressure of the deep sea. The rescue was underway. 3:15 in the morning. The dry deck shelter, attached to the hull of the USS North Carolina, was a cramped steel cylinder. It was a tomb of shadows and cold metal. The 10 SEALs of Alpha Element sat in 2 rows, facing each other. Their knees were nearly touching in the narrow space. The red light of the compartment reflected off their black diving masks. The air was thick with the smell of wet rubber and the sharp, metallic tang of bottled oxygen. The team leader raised a gloved hand. He gave a single, firm thumbs up. Every man began the final check. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace born of 1,000 rehearsals. They checked the pressure gauges on their wrists. They checked the waterproof seals on their Mark 18 suppressed rifles. They felt the heavy weight of the demolition charges strapped to their thighs. The submarine was 200 feet below the surface of the South China Sea. The external hull groaned. It was the sound of tens of thousands of tons of steel resisting the weight of the ocean. The sound echoed inside the shelter like a dying heartbeat. Then the hissing started. High-pressure pumps began to flood the shelter with seawater. The water was 54 degrees. It was a shock to the system. The cold stung where it touched the exposed skin on their faces. The level rose quickly in the red light. It covered their boots, it rose past their laps, it reached their shoulders. One by one, the seals bit down on their regulators. The sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing filled the communications loop. It was a mechanical, hollow sound. The water reached the ceiling. The shelter was full. The red light flickered and then died. They were in absolute darkness. The pressure inside the shelter began to climb. It equalized with the crushing weight of the ocean outside. The seals felt the squeeze in their ears and their lungs. They waited for the signal. A green light on the bulkhead flashed twice. The outer hatch began to grind open. A massive slab of steel moved aside. It revealed a wall of absolute blackness. The seals pushed their underwater delivery vehicle out into the void. The craft was a sleek, black shape, 12 feet long. It looked like a ghost in the dark water. The submarine was a silent giant behind them. It faded into the gloom in seconds. They were alone in the deep. The pilot of the delivery vehicle gripped the controls. He watched the dim glow of the navigation screen. They were 5 miles from Trident Alpha. The craft moved at 5 knots. It was silent. It was invisible to the radar and sonar of the world above. The water was a thick, ink-black curtain. Tiny sparks of bioluminescence flashed past their masks like falling stars. Each flash was a reminder of the life in the void. But the seals were focused only on the mission. They were hunters in the dark. The current was strong. It pulled at the small craft, trying to push it off course. The pilot fought the controls. He adjusted the trim. He watched the digital compass. They stayed at a depth of 60 feet. They were deep enough to avoid the surface chop, but shallow enough to save their oxygen. 10 minutes passed in dead silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the electric motor and the pulse of their own blood in their ears. Then a massive shadow appeared on the sonar screen. It was a jagged, towering signature. It was the roots of the oil rig. Trident Alpha was close. The pilot steered the craft toward the south pylon. The massive steel pillars of the platform rose out of the seafloor like the legs of a giant. They were covered in barnacles and rust. The water around the pylons was turbulent. It swirled in dangerous eddies. The seals prepared to exit the vehicle. They unclipped their safety lines. They checked their weapons one last time. They could feel the vibration of the platform's massive machinery through the water. It was a low, heavy thrum that vibrated in their chests. They moved toward the maintenance ladder. It was a narrow strip of yellow steel bolted to the pylon. It was slick with sea growth. The lead diver reached out and grabbed the lowest rung. He pulled himself out of the current. He looked up. The surface was 40 feet above. He could see the faint, shimmering light of the moon through the water. He could also see the black silhouettes of the lower decks. The enemy was up there. They were waiting. The seals began their climb. They moved out of the water and into the war. 3:45 in the morning. The base of the South Pylon. The lead seal, Lieutenant Miller, broke the surface of the South China Sea. He stayed deep in the shadow of a massive structural beam. The water was a swirling mess of white foam and dark oil. 10 men joined him on the narrow maintenance ledge. Their black tactical gear was heavy and dripping with salt water. Above them, the platform loomed like a jagged mountain of steel. The sound of waves slamming the pillars blotted out their breathing. "Sensors ahead," Miller whispered into his bone conduction headset. He pointed to a small, blinking red light on a support strut. It was an infrared motion detector tied to the main security grid. One SEAL pulled a canister of specialized foam from his tactical vest. He coated the lens of the sensor with a thick, gray spray. The light stayed red, but the electronic eye was now blind. They began to climb the vertical ladder toward the maintenance deck. The steel rungs were slick with grease and sea salt. Every step was a calculated risk in the heavy darkness. One slip would send a man into the churning machinery below. The air smelled of diesel fuel and wet rust. They reached the secondary deck, 30 feet above the water. Two Chinese guards walked the catwalk directly above their heads. Their boots made a rhythmic clanking sound on the metal grating. The SEALs froze, pressing their bodies against the cold steel pipes. The guards stopped for a moment to check their weapons. The smell of cigarette smoke drifted down through the floor. Miller watched them through his night vision goggles. Their silhouettes were bright green against the black sky. They talked in low voices and then moved toward the north side. Their footsteps faded into the sound of the wind. "Move," Miller signaled with a flat hand. The team flowed upward like a shadow. They used magnetic climbers to scale the smooth sections of the hull. They avoided the main stairs and the open walkways. They moved through a labyrinth of high-pressure pipes and valves. This was the gut of the oil platform. The air here was hot and smelled of industrial chemicals. They reached a heavy steel hatch marked Pump Room 2. This was the back door into the main structure. A SEAL knelt by the electronic lock. He bypassed the keypad in exactly 12 seconds. The door clicked open with a soft metallic snap. Inside, the roar of the pumps was deafening. The floor vibrated with the power of the massive engines. The air was thick with the scent of hot lubricant and pressurized steam. Miller led the way into the heat and the noise. They were inside the heart of the fortress now. The pump room was a forest of steel. Thick pipes painted in bright yellow and red crossed the ceiling. Steam hissed from a relief valve in the corner. The team moved in a staggered line between the humming machinery. Every shadow was a potential hiding place for an enemy sentry. They reached the far end of the room near the main electrical trunk. Miller signaled for a halt. He checked the floor plan on a small tablet strapped to his wrist. The galley was 3 levels up and 40 meters to the east. The path would take them through the main processing deck. That area would be heavily guarded by the enemy commando team. Alpha 1, Alpha 2. "Take the stairs," Miller whispered. "The rest of the team will use the service elevator shaft." They split into 2 groups with mechanical precision. One group vanished into the dark stairwell. The others pried open the heavy doors of the elevator. The shaft was a vertical tunnel of black grease and hanging cables. They began to climb the cold steel rungs inside the shaft. The vibration of the platform felt stronger here. It was a deep, bone-shaking hum that never stopped. They reached the processing level and paused. They could hear voices through the closed elevator doors. The language was Mandarin, spoken in short, sharp bursts. The enemy was close. The SEALs checked their weapons one last time. They adjusted their masks and tightened their gear. The time for stealth was coming to an end. The breach was next. 4:15 in the morning. The processing deck of Trident Alpha. Lieutenant Miller gripped the handle of the service elevator door, his fingers tight, against the cold, greasy metal. 3 meters away, behind a thin sheet of steel, the voices of the Chinese commandos grew louder. They were arguing about a malfunctioning pressure gauge. The air in the elevator shaft was a stagnant pool of hot oil and the sharp chemical bite of sulfur. The platform groaned, a deep, metallic protest against the shifting tide of the South China Sea. Miller looked at his team. The green glow of their night vision goggles made them look like ghosts carved from the shadows. He raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The SEALs at the stairwell door and the elevator shaft moved in perfect, lethal synchronization. A flashbang grenade was rolled through the gap in the elevator doors. 2 seconds of agonizing silence followed. Then a white flash bleached the world. The detonation was a physical blow that cracked the air. The trigger was squeezed. Miller's Mark 18 suppressed rifle shrieked as it cycled through 30 rounds in 3 seconds. The white column of muzzle. Gas punching forward into the smoke. The heat blast from the suppressed barrel washed across his gloved hands, smelling of burnt cordite and hot carbon. The sound was a series of rhythmic, metallic thuds that cut through the ringing in the room. The first 2 rounds punched clean through the lead. Commando's tactical vest, shattering the ceramic plates and driving fragments of carbon fiber into his chest. He was sent flying backward, his boots skidding across. The slick metal grating before his head slammed into a high-pressure steam pipe. A thick, dark spray of red erupted instantly, coating the yellow machinery. Behind him, the second commando was hit in the shoulder, the force of the 5.56mm rounds spinning him around like a rag doll until he collapsed into a heap of black nylon and blood. The remaining defenders did not freeze. They dove for cover behind a row of heavy oxygen cylinders, their own weapons erupting in a chaotic spray of lead. Tracers tore through the air, looking like angry red wasps in the dark. One Chinese commando wrenched his rifle upward and held the trigger down, sending a blind volley toward the elevator doors. Sparks flew as the rounds shredded the steel frame, sending jagged shards of metal whistling past Miller's head. A SEAL on the left flank grunted as a round grazed his shoulder, but he did not stop firing. He leaned into the recoil, his weapon spitting fire until the enemy shooter was suppressed. The processing deck became a chaotic tunnel of smoke and screaming metal. The flash of the muzzles bleached the sky white for a fraction of a second, followed by a darkness that felt twice as heavy. Black smoke boiled out from a ruptured oil line, filling the room with the thick, acrid stink of burning petroleum. The sound of the exchange was a deafening roar that cracked eardrums and drowned out the vibration of the platform's engines. Then, a sudden, dead silence fell over the deck. The only sound was the hiss of escaping steam and the rhythmic clinking of hot brass shell casings settling onto the metal floor. The smoke was so thick that the SEALs could only see the glowing red embers of the fire they had just started. The enemy voices had stopped. The primary resistance on the processing deck had been broken in less than 40 seconds. Miller stepped over a shattered console, his boots crunching on broken glass. He signaled for his medic to check the wounded SEAL. The man waved him off, already reloading a fresh magazine into his rifle. They could hear screaming coming from the level above. It was the hostages. The gunfire had alerted the execution team in the galley. Alpha 2, secure the stairs, Miller whispered. His voice was a rasping growl over the radio. Alpha 1 is moving on the galley. We have 3 minutes before they start. Killing civilians. Move. They did not wait for the smoke to clear. They ran through the haze, their boots pounding a frantic rhythm on the steel catwalks. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced entirely by the stench of war. The final door was ahead. It was a heavy, reinforced bulkhead that led directly into the crew's living quarters. Miller reached the door and felt the heat radiating from the other side. Someone was screaming inside, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He didn't look at the keypad. He didn't look for a handle. He placed a strip of C4 explosive along the hinges. 4:20 in the morning, the galley of Trident Alpha. The C4 strip detonated with a sharp, ear-splitting crack that felt like a physical punch to the chest. The heavy steel bulkhead didn't just open. It was blasted straight off its hinges by the immense overpressure of the explosive. Lieutenant Miller stepped through the roiling gray smoke before the metal had even hit the floor, his Mark 18 rifle shrieking as he depressed the trigger. A white-hot lance of muzzle fire lit the dark room. For a fraction of a second, the sharp, chemical bite of burning propellant filling his lungs instantly. The first 3 rounds caught the lead Chinese commando in the throat and upper chest, the kinetic energy sending him crashing backward into a stainless steel prep table. The table buckled under the impact, sending metal trays and industrial-sized cans of oil clattering across the floor in a deafening spray of noise. A second burst from Miller's weapon shredded the wooden cabinets behind a second shooter, sending a cloud of white splinters and fine dust into the air as the man's shoulder was nearly severed by the high-velocity fire. He fell in a heap, his blood pooling rapidly on the white linoleum floor. The remaining Chinese defenders dove behind the heavy central island of the kitchen, their own submachine guns erupting in a frantic, stuttering response. Bullets hammered into the doorframe around Miller, sparking off the steel and sending jagged fragments of hot copper into his tactical vest. The noise inside the confined space was absolute, a roar of machinery, and gunfire that drowned out the screams of the civilians. One commando lunged toward a group of terrified hostages huddled in the corner, his weapon raised to fire. But a SEAL marksman behind Miller caught him in mid-stride. The round entered his temple, his head snapping sideways before he collapsed in a heap of black gear and broken glass. The room fell into a terrifying, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing and the low, guttering hiss of a ruptured gas line near the stoves. A thick layer of white dust and gray smoke hung in the air, settling over the terrified oil workers who crouched on the floor with their hands over their ears. The smell of the room was a sickening mix of burnt hair, hot metal, and the iron scent of fresh blood. Miller didn't lower his weapon. He scanned the room, his eyes moving with mechanical precision behind his night vision goggles. The green tint of the lenses made the carnage look like a scene from a nightmare. "Status," he barked over the radio. "Room clear," a voice replied through his headset. 3 targets neutralized. No SEAL casualties. Hostages appear secure. No SEAL casualties. Hostages appear secure. The oil workers were shaking, some of them weeping openly. One man, a technician with a gash on his forehead, looked up at Miller. His eyes were wide and vacant, the shock of the explosion still rattling his brain. The SEALs moved among them, their movements efficient and silent. They used tactical shears to cut the plastic zip ties from the workers' wrists. "Stay low," Miller told them, his voice calm but firm. "We are getting you out of here. Follow my men." But the mission was only half over. The sound of the breach had echoed throughout the entire platform. On the deck above, more boots were pounding against the metal grating. The remaining PLA commandos were regrouping. They knew the SEALs were in the galley, and they knew they had lost the initiative. A heavy thud vibrated through the floor. It wasn't gunfire, it was the sound of a heavy door being locked from the outside. The SEALs and the 20 hostages were now trapped in the galley. The only way out was the way they came, or through the service hatches that led to the upper helicopter pad. "Miller, this is Alpha 2. A voice crackled in his ear. "We have movement on the roof. They are bringing up a heavy machine gun. If we try to move the hostages across the open deck, they'll be cut to pieces." The temperature in the room was rising. The fire from the ruptured gas line was spreading to the grease filters in the exhaust hoods. Black, oily smoke began to curl along the ceiling. The air was becoming unbreathable. Miller looked at the hostages, then at the burning kitchen. "We don't go across the deck," Miller said, his mind racing through the schematics of the platform. "We go up the external ladder to the helipad. We need air support now. 7th Fleet says the birds are 2 minutes out," the operator replied. "But the roof is hot. You've got a Type 85 machine gun nested near the control tower. You stick your head up there, it's gone." Miller looked at his lead breacher. "Get the remaining charges. We're not going through the door. We're going through the ceiling." The SEALs began to move the hostages away from the center of the room. They piled heavy kitchen equipment and tables into a makeshift barricade. Louder, a predatory growl that competed with the wind outside. The steel walls of the galley began to groan as they expanded from the heat. "1 minute to extraction," the radio chirped. "Make it count, Alpha 1, 4:22 in the morning." The galley of Trident Alpha was a furnace of choking black smoke and screaming steel. The heat from the spreading grease fire had turned the overhead plating a dull, glowing cherry red. Lieutenant Miller could feel the skin on his neck blistering. The air was a thick soup of melting plastic and the sharp, suffocating sting of carbon monoxide. He looked at the ceiling. The structural beams were starting to warp. "Breacher, now!" Miller shouted. The lead breacher slapped a final strip of flexible explosive against the overhead beam. He didn't use a timer. He pulled the manual igniter. Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! The ceiling didn't just break, it vanished in a vertical column of white flame and jagged metal shards. The overpressure of the blast sucked the black smoke out of the room for a split second, revealing the stars above. The SEALs didn't wait for the debris to stop falling. They shoved the first 5 hostages up the scorched ladder and onto the cold, salt-laden air of the helipad. The transition from the furnace of the galley to the freezing wind of the South China Sea was a physical shock, but there was no time to breathe. Immediately, the Type 85 heavy machine gun opened up from the control tower 300 meters to the north. The rounds were the size of small fingers, glowing a malevolent red as they tore through the darkness. They hammered into the steel decking with the sound of a giant sledgehammer, sending showers of white sparks and jagged metal splinters into the air. One round punched through a heavy equipment crate, turning the heavy tools inside into shrapnel that whistled past Miller's ear. "Get down! Keep them flat!" Miller roared, pushing 2 oil workers onto the vibrating deck. One SEAL, Petty Officer Chen, dropped to one knee and returned fire with his Mark 18 suppressed rifle. He sent 3-round bursts toward the flashes in the tower, but the 5.56mm rounds were no match for the heavy steel barricade of the machine gun nest. The enemy gunner was dialed in. He walked the stream of heavy fire across the helipad, the bullets chewing through the safety netting and snapping the thick steel cables like they were made of string. Then, the vibration of the deck changed. It wasn't the platform's machinery anymore. It was a rhythmic, bone-shaking thrum that came from the black horizon. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters roared over the edge of the platform, flying so low that their rotor wash kicked up a massive spray of white seawater against the lower pylons. They looked like giant, predatory insects in the moonlight. The pilots didn't wait for a request. The side-mounted M134 miniguns erupted in a continuous 3-foot lance of yellow flame. The sound was a deep, mechanical growl, like a massive chainsaw cutting through the sky. 6,000 rounds per minute chewed into the control tower. The steel plating was turned into a shredded mess of scrap metal and smoke in 3 seconds. The Type 85 heavy machine gun went silent instantly, the weapon and its crew obliterated by the overwhelming wall of lead. "Clear! Move to the birds!" The lead helicopter flared its nose, the tail rotor swinging around to hold a hover just inches above the deck. The wind from the rotor blades was a freezing blast that smelled of jet fuel and the open ocean. It pushed back the heat of the fire for a few precious seconds. Miller grabbed the next hostage, a woman trembling so hard she could barely stand, and hoisted her toward the open cabin door. A crew chief in a flight helmet reached out and hauled her inside. The remaining Chinese commandos on the roof realized their heavy support was gone. They broke from their positions behind the ventilation ducts and began a desperate retreat toward the lifeboats on the north side of the platform. They fired blindly as they ran, their tracers arcing uselessly into the dark sky. One SEAL took a round to the outer thigh and collapsed, his blood appearing stark and black on the moonlit deck. He didn't scream. He rolled to his side and kept his weapon trained on the retreating enemy. His teammate grabbed the shoulder straps of his tactical vest and dragged him toward the second helicopter, never stopping his own suppressive fire. The air was a chaotic swirl of noise, the scream of the helicopter turbines, the roar of the fire below, and the frantic, sobbing breaths of the rescued workers. Miller looked back at the hole they had blown in the ceiling. The galley was now a solid wall of orange flame. The platform groaned again, a deep, structural shiver that suggested the main supports were beginning to fail under the intense heat of the well-fed fire. 12 hostages were already in the birds, 8 to go. The helicopters were heavy, their engines straining to maintain a hover in the turbulent air above the burning rig. "Load them up! We are running out of deck!" Miller yelled over the radio. "Alpha, 2, give me a perimeter. Nothing gets close to these birds." 4:28 in the morning. The helipad of Trident Alpha, the second MH-60 Sierra helicopter, was already heavy with the weight of 12 survivors. The steel deck beneath Miller's boots was vibrating with a violent, new energy. The fire in the galley had finally reached the main riser. The air was a thick, poisonous mix of burning crude and hot hydraulic fluid. The last 8 hostages were hauled into the cabin by their collars. Their faces were masks of soot and tears. Miller signaled the pilot to lift. A lone Chinese commando rose from the shadows of a radar dome. He rested a rocket-propelled grenade launcher on his shoulder. The trigger was squeezed. The rocket shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors on the flight deck. The projectile missed the lead helicopter's tail by exactly 2 meters. It slammed into the massive crane on the north deck. The warhead punched clean through the main pivot, detonating the pressurized oil tanks inside. A fireball erupted, bleaching the sky white for 3 full seconds. The crane began to lean, a sound of metal tearing that was a scream cutting through the rotor noise. The pilot of the second helicopter didn't wait for the debris to settle. He wrenched the controls, the bird banking hard. As the falling crane missed the rotor blades by inches, the door gunner returned fire instantly. The M134 minigun growled, shredding the radar dome and everything behind it. The enemy shooter was obliterated in a spray of sparks and flying debris. The helicopter surged upward into the dark sky. Miller looked down from the open door. The platform was a jagged crown of fire, in the middle of the sea. The heat was so intense that the heavy steel pillars were beginning to glow. Huge chunks of the upper deck were breaking off and falling into the water. Each impact sent a plume of white steam 100 feet into the air. The smell of the sea was back, cold and sharp against his burned face. All survivors accounted for. The crew chief yelled over the intercom, "We are clear of the blast zone." The 2 helicopters flew in a tight wedge, moving away from the inferno. Below them, the South China Sea was an ink-black void. In the distance, the lights of the USS North Carolina surfaced for a brief moment. The submarine looked like a black whale rising for air. It was waiting for its children to come home. The 20 oil workers sat on the floor of the cabin. They were wrapped in green wool blankets. Some were staring at their feet in silence. Others were holding on to the seals as if they were made of stone. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. The cabin smelled of sweat, salt, and the metallic tang of blood. Miller leaned his head back against the bulkhead. His hands were still shaking from the heat of the fire. He looked at the man sitting across from him, a technician who had lost his shoes. The man reached out and touched Miller's dusty shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once. The helicopters banked toward the west. The sun was still an hour away, but the horizon was turning a faint, dusty gray. The mission was over. The platform was gone, but the people were alive. Miller closed his eyes and listened to the steady beat of the rotors. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of the world coming back into focus. 5:45 in the morning. The flight deck of the carrier USS Gerald R. Ford. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters descended through a thick bank of morning mist. Their landing lights cut through the gray light in long, trembling fingers. The deck crews were already in position. They wore bright purple and green vests that stood out against the steel. The helicopters touched down with a heavy, mechanical bounce. The wheels locked into the deck. The rotors began their long, whining deceleration. The side doors slid open with a sharp, metallic bang. The 20 hostages were the first to emerge. They stepped onto the flight deck with shaky, uncertain legs. The wind from the carrier's movement at 30 knots was cold and clean. It blew away the last lingering smell of burning oil and sulfur. Navy medics in white vests ran forward with stretchers and thermal blankets. They moved with professional, quiet speed. The oil workers were led toward the island structure. Some of them looked back at the helicopters. Others simply stared at the horizon, their faces blank with shock. The SEALs of Alpha Element were the last to exit. They did not run. They walked with a heavy, rhythmic stride. Their gear was scorched. Their faces were black with soot and salt spray. Lieutenant Miller stepped onto the deck and pulled off his tactical helmet. His hair was matted with sweat. He watched the medics take the wounded SEAL toward the elevators. The man gave a sharp nod as he was rolled away. He would live. Miller walked to the edge of the flight deck. He looked toward the south. 60 miles away, a column of black smoke rose into the sky. It looked like a jagged scar against the rising sun. Trident Alpha was no longer visible on the waterline. The fire had finally reached the primary storage tanks. The structural integrity of the steel pylons had failed under the heat. The platform had collapsed into the sea in a final, massive eruption of steam. Now, only a slick of oil and floating debris remained. A communications officer approached Miller. He held out a ruggedized tablet. "Admiral Miller is on the line from Yokosuka, sir," the officer said. Miller took the tablet. The admiral's face appeared on the screen, lit by the blue glow of the command center. "Status report, Lieutenant," the admiral said. "Mission accomplished, sir," Miller replied. His voice was a dry, hollow rasp. "All 20 hostages are on deck. 1 SEAL wounded, stable. The platform has been destroyed. The enemy boarding team has been neutralized." The admiral nodded once. "Well done, Alpha 1. Get your men to medical and get some sleep. The State Department is already handling the fallout. The Chinese Navy has retreated to their territorial waters. The sector is clear." The screen went black. Miller handed the tablet back to the officer. He felt the weight of his tactical vest pressing into his shoulders. He felt every bruise and every burn. The adrenaline was gone now. There was only the cold wind and the steady roll of the carrier. He looked at his team. They were already stripping off their gear. They were cleaning their weapons with practiced, silent movements. They did not celebrate. They did not talk about the fire or the rockets. The job was done. The sun finally broke over the horizon. It was a pale, cold yellow that turned the sea to liquid lead. The carrier turned into the wind, preparing for the next flight of fighters. The sound of the jet engines began to drown out everything else. It was a roar of power that shook the deck and the air. Miller turned away from the smoke on the horizon. He walked toward the hatch leading to the lower decks. He didn't look back. The South China Sea returned to its restless, empty state. The debris from Trident Alpha was already being carried away by the currents. The oily slick began to break apart under the white caps. The silence returned to the deep water. The battle was over.